Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Tip. My name is Julian, and this is an exciting episode for you guys. My number 2 episode of my preseason content, guys. This is my hits and my misses from my preseason last year. Obviously, guys, the title of the video pretty much explains what I'm going to do today, and let's talk about where I went wrong and what I got right last year, just to offer you guys complete transparency, just to let you guys know that I know where I went wrong and I'm taking accountability, and that way in the future I can continue to make better and better predictions for future seasons. Now, before we get started, guys, please leave a like and hit that subscribe button, guys. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, I promise you it is the #1 place to gather fantasy hockey advice and intel to help you win your fantasy leagues. I got a lot of people commenting at the end of the year thanking me for helping me win their leagues. So definitely it does feel good to hear that, and it does help me know that I am giving good advice and helping you guys each and every week of the season and for the preseason. And obviously, guys, if you want to subscribe to my Patreon, the link is down below in the description, and it does include my whole preseason schedule and a couple of other perks like early access videos. And I am recording a lot of these videos early, so if you do want to see them before they come out, if you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll be able to do that. So now let's start with the content of this video, and let's start with my misses from last year. And the biggest one was Aaron Ekblad. I had him ranked as the #5 best defenseman in my rankings, and he really disappointed. Obviously, there was some injury stuff going on there, but he didn't end up missing really that much time last year. He still played 71 games, but he was truly disappointing and finished as the #39th best defenseman in hits leagues and 31st best in non-hits league, which is a really big discrepancy from the #5 defenseman spot that I had him in. But obviously, I wasn't the only one that made this prediction, because Ekblad the year before was a top 5 defenseman. He was absolutely fantastic, and it was pretty hard to project him falling off this much. On top of that, guys, Brandon Montour had a huge coming out party that nobody could have possibly predicted. And he's now Florida's #1 defenseman. I'm projecting him to have a really nice year this year. And Ekblad is going to be really low on my list. He's going to be pretty low, and honestly, with the injuries he suffered in the playoffs, I'm scared of drafting Ekblad altogether this year, but that was definitely a miss for me last year. Mackenzie Weegar was another guy who just disappointed last year. I ranked him as a #15 defenseman, which is pretty much around the same range-ish where most people were ranking him. He ended up finishing as the 50th best defenseman overall, and that's only because he had a decent end of year. The entire year, Mackenzie Weegar was pretty much droppable in most leagues. Like, he really delivered a very subpar season, and unfortunately ended up being a really bad call by me to draft him as the #15 best defenseman. Now this year, though, with Calgary having a new coach in that, I do think he's going to have a nice rebound year, so I will recommend drafting Weegar again this year, but he's going to be going a lot later this year, and that's why he's going to be a much better value. Jonathan Huberdeau. Do I have to say anything about Jonathan Huberdeau? I don't think anybody could have seen him dropping off as far as he did last year. Obviously, for me, I believe I had him as either a top 10 or top 15 player, and obviously ended up being 100 and something best fantasy player in most leagues, and that's just not acceptable from a guy who's supposed to be as good as Jonathan Huberdeau is. He just couldn't find it last year. It reminded me a little bit of Elias Pettersson a couple years ago, where he just could not get it going, and it didn't make any sense. People were dropping him, and then finally, towards the end of the season, he figured it out and started producing at his normal Elias Pettersson rate. Now, obviously, Elias Pettersson, he's an elite player. Last year, scored over 100 points, was one of the best fantasy players overall. Jonathan Huberdeau, I do think is going to rebound next year. I don't have him ranked even remotely as high this year, but definitely, I do think he's going to have a much better year under a new coach. Another miss that I had was Jack Quinn. I ranked him as the #3 rookie last year, right after McTavish and Matty Beniers as #1. So Beniers was a good call. McTavish, not so much. But Jack Quinn, I really hyped him up, guys. I put him a lot higher than a lot of people had them on their list, and unfortunately he did not really deliver. He definitely showed some flashes, but he was not really viable in fantasy really at all. So that's definitely my bad, but he was at best a dart throw at the end of drafts, so you really didn't lose out too much by drafting Jack Quinn in your league. I know I drafted him in a league or two, and you just drop him after a couple weeks, no big deal. So luckily, that advice probably didn't hurt you too much. And last but not least, Elvis Merzlikins is a goalie that I was really liking in the offseason last year. He's someone that faces a lot of shots generally, and I didn't think Columbus was going to be that awful as they were last year. So that's my bad. Merzlikins just did not have a good year between injuries and Columbus just being awful last year. So unfortunately, he's definitely a miss for me last year. But this year, I mean, Columbus is getting a little bit better. I'm definitely dropping him a lot in my rankings. I think he might be serviceable again, especially now that they don't have Korpisalo, so he's really going to be the guy expected to take the bulk of the starts. All right, so now that I've gone through some of my misses, obviously there was a couple more than that, but that's pretty much, summarizing a decent amount of them there. And let's jump into some of the hits that I had last year. And first on the list, I do have Roope Hintz. And if you watched my late round draft steals video last year, he was going at an ADP of 133.5. He ended up as a top 50 player in most leagues. Now, in that video, I told you guys, draft Roope Hintz at 133.5. This is an absolute steal ranking for Roope Hintz. If you listen to me, you got really rewarded because, like I just said, he was a top 50 player in most league formats last year. So definitely, you got rewarded if you watched that video and did exactly what I said for Roope Hintz, because that was a guy who I was really high on. Moritz Seider. I advise people to avoid him at his ADP. He was going super early last year in draft, and to me, it was too high. And obviously, I could not have projected this. I thought he was still going to have a pretty good year, but Hronek ended up passing him on the depth chart and was put on the top power play for whatever reason. And then Moritz Seider just didn't get power play one time for a long time and just wasn't producing very well. He was almost droppable at points of the season last year. So if you had listened to me and not drafted Moritz Seider where he was going last year, you were definitely rewarded by not having him on your team, because he was definitely a huge hindrance to guys that did have him for a lot of the season last year. Owen Power was another hit for me, guys. He was very highly touted. People were drafting him really early last year in fantasy drafts. And to me, guys, it just didn't make any sense, because I was like, well, Rasmus Dahlin is ahead of him on the depth chart. And as good of a talent as Owen Power is, the opportunity just isn't there for him to really produce that much and be that great of a fantasy asset. And obviously, he didn't have a terrible year, guys, but he just really wasn't much of a fantasy asset. He was droppable in the vast majority of leagues. And I was a big hit for me, guys. So if you listened to me and avoided him in drafts, you got rewarded by not having, someone who's pretty much doing nothing on your team. Bowen Byram is another guy that I told you to avoid because he was going way too early in the draft, and his opportunity is always limited with the guys ahead of him in the lineup. Like, you got Devon Taves and you've got Cale Makar, two really amazing defensemen, pretty much ahead of him in the depth chart, guys. So while sometimes Byram might take PP1 over Devon Taves, Makar is locked into that spot. So unless Makar is injured, Bowen Byram is not getting that spot. And like I said, guys, I was very scared he was going to get injured, and he did miss time with an injury, as I predicted. So Bowen Byram was a big hit for me there. If you avoided him, you were probably really happy you did. Tyler Toffoli is another guy I brought up in my late round draft steals video. He was going last year at an ADP of 164.9 and ended up a top 75 player in most leagues. I told you guys in that video that at that ADP, Tyler Toffoli could end up being a really good value. And if you listen and ended up drafting him in your draft, you were very pleasantly rewarded, because a top 75 player, it was incredible for him to see from him. And that was his best season he's ever had. And finally, let's talk about Josh Morrissey. Last year, again in my late round draft steals video, he was one of only two defensemen that I talked about, and the last one I talked about was only 1% owned, and that was Justin Schultz, who ended up, probably being better than 1% owned, so that definitely was a decently good shot in the dark at him. But Josh Morrissey was the other defenseman I talked about in that video, and if you listen to me, guys, he was a top 5 defenseman in the league last year, okay? Obviously, I wasn't projecting him to be a top 5 defenseman in the league last year, but I did tell you guys that going that late, he was pretty freaking good value, and he was one of the better value defensemen in my mind. And he was one of the better defensemen in my mind going that late in the draft because his opportunity was the best out of anyone going that late. And if you did listen and grabbed him as defenseman that late, that may have even won you your league because he did so well. Obviously, didn't expect him to do that well, but I did advise people to pick him up, and luckily, that really paid off if you did. And that's all I wanted to talk about today, guys. I'm going to continue to deliver the best fantasy hockey content I can all preseason, all of this offseason, to make sure that you guys have the best possible drafts for your fantasy leagues. Because that is my job here, right? This is what I'm sitting in front of a computer recording this for. This is why I do this, because I want you guys to have successful drafts and have really, really good seasons overall, and just really enjoy playing fantasy. And you will enjoy playing fantasy a lot more if your team is competitive and you draft yourself a nice team. You don't have to do as much work during the regular season. Obviously, you do have to do a lot of work during the regular season to make sure your team stays competitive, make the best pickups. But it all starts here at the draft, and it's my job to make sure you guys have the best draft possible. And with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Fantasy Tipped.